In just seconds, my face went numb, my left eye blurred, and I fell to the floor. The cup shattered into hundreds of pieces at my feet. Frank later said that sound saved me. He rushed into the kitchen. He was a former firefighter, so he immediately recognized the signs of a stroke: crooked mouth, dazed eyes, limp right hand, and no response to his calls. Fortunately, Frank immediately called 911. My memory is fragmented: the sound of the ambulance siren, flashing lights, a feeling of coldness and utter confusion. Before I begin my story, if you find it inspiring, please hit the like button and don't forget to share it with your loved ones. Subscribe to my YouTube channel to not miss my upcoming shares about my journey overcoming illness. Each subscription is a motivation for me to continue sharing and inspiring more people. Now, let's begin the story, from wheelchair to mountain peak. My name is Eleanor Thompson, and I've lived in Kansas for over 60 years. At 65, my hair has turned silver, but I still enjoy driving myself to the store and tending to my small rose garden behind the house. I loved everything about normal life: barbecues with children and grandchildren, art classes at church, and late afternoon walks with my dog Max on the lawn. I never thought I would become a patient, much less imagined that one day a wheelchair would become part of my life. And then, that fateful morning came, a cold but clear Monday morning in March. I woke up early, made coffee for my husband, Frank, as I had done every day for 40 years. I was planning to text birthday wishes to an old friend in Texas, but my fingers suddenly became clumsy, and I couldn't type the message. I tried to call Frank, but the sound that came out was strange, like a breathless whisper. In just seconds, my face went numb, my left eye blurred, and I fell to the floor. The cup shattered into hundreds of pieces at my feet. Frank later said that sound saved me. He rushed into the kitchen. He was a former firefighter, so he immediately recognized the signs of a stroke: crooked mouth, dazed eyes, limp right hand, and no response to his calls. Fortunately, Frank immediately called 911. My memory is fragmented: the sound of the ambulance siren, flashing lights, a feeling of coldness and utter confusion. Waking up in the hospital, I received news no one wants to hear: "Mrs. Eleanor, you've had a cerebral infarction." The doctor was kind, but his words drowned me like cold water. I couldn't speak, the right side of my body wouldn't move. All sounds in my head echoed as if from the bottom of a well. Constant checks. Machines, wires, 4 drips. I just lay there, looking up at the bright ceiling, trying to close my eyes to escape reality. Those first days, I could only silently cry. Each time I saw Frank quietly wiping away tears beside the bed, I hurt more than any physical pain. There were times when I asked myself, why me? Where is the strong Eleanor? I had steadfastly faced the death of my mother, my father, survived the storm of '79, and carried 3 children through seasons of illness. But lying here, unable to go to the bathroom by myself, unable to move my arm, I felt like I had turned to stone. The doctor said, "There is hope." But I couldn't see that light anywhere. 4 days later, I was transferred to physical therapy for the first time. They put me on a training chair, with a belt around my waist to prevent falling. The young nurse named Karen, blonde with a gentle smile, told me, "Mrs. Eleanor, it's okay. We're here. Let me help you step by step." When Karen moved my right arm, the arm I thought was dead, my tears just kept flowing. Pain, shame, humiliation, everything. I hated the feeling of having to rely on others, hated the pitying looks from everyone, and especially hated the thought that I would never walk on my own feet again. But then, in the midst of that despair, a small miracle happened. On Tuesday afternoon, I faintly heard Max, my dog, barking in the hallway. Frank had secretly asked permission from the nurse to let Max visit me, if only for a moment. Right then, I felt my foot, tingling, then itching. I called Karen, tried to signal, and she exclaimed, "You still have feeling." "Wonderful, Eleanor." I sobbed, but this time because I knew there was still hope. Being told I had to move to a wheelchair, I felt devastated. It wasn't just a means of transportation, it was a symbol of freedom taken away. The hospital arranged for me a new wheelchair, with shiny wheels and a sturdy backrest, but I didn't want to look at it. I missed the days when I could get up and pour coffee myself, reach out to cut flowers in the garden, walk Max down the street. Karen, the nurse, was the first to encourage me to accept the new reality. "Eleanor, think of the wheelchair as a stepping stone, not a destination." I laughed, a weak smile, but kindling. I knew I couldn't choose my circumstances, only how to face them. The first training sessions were hell, transferring from bed to wheelchair, from wheelchair to dining room chair. Each movement felt like someone stabbing through me. The pain, helplessness, and shame of having to ask others for help made me cry myself to sleep many nights. I often looked out the hospital room window and remembered my childhood, when my legs could carry me running through the endless green fields in rural Kansas where I grew up. I remembered festive days, when my parents took me to the park, and my feet never tired despite running all day. The thought of those legs haunted me, both as pain and as a silent motivation. Frank was always by my side. He didn't mind staying up all night to help me with hygiene, brush my hair, encourage me every morning. Sometimes, he would read aloud humorous stories about elderly people who loved adventure that I still enjoyed hearing. He repeated one phrase, "You are much stronger than you think." Max, the faithful dog, each time he came to the hospital would run straight to my feet, as if to say, "Don't give up, Eleanor." I began to befriend others in the same situation at the hospital, especially Mary, a 74-year-old former nurse who had suffered a severe stroke. She told me dozens of extraordinary stories about people who were thought unable to recover but finally stood up and continued. Sometimes at night, I closed my eyes, imagining myself standing in a flower garden, sunlight on my face, head held high and feet firmly planted. The battle with myself was the most grueling. Every day Karen and the therapist David came, bringing physical therapy and language exercises. The simplest exercise was lifting my right arm off the table or squeezing a soft ball, yet I struggled, sweating, and often ended up crying right on the training chair. Sometimes I managed to utter a few garbled syllables, a hoarse laugh as I tried to read a short story. David was always patient, smiling, guiding me through each mouth movement, praising every syllable that came out clear enough for him to understand. I remember the first afternoon I lifted my right arm just a few inches off the table. It was a tiny moment, but both Karen and David clapped and congratulated me as if I'd accomplished a miracle. That night, I couldn't sleep, just kept smiling for pride. After many weeks of perseverance, I wheeled myself out into the hallway, opened the hospital window to breathe fresh air for the first time on my own. I wrote down my daily progress, even the smallest things, moving my index finger, pronouncing the word home clearly, transferring myself from bed to wheelchair. Those simple joys revived the feeling of a child learning to walk. Mary told me stories about Mr. Henry, who used to be at this center, who last year needed a feeding tube, yet now led hiking groups in Colorado. "If Henry can do it, so can you," she said. Her eyes sparkled each time, and I realized that determination was the strongest medicine of all. In the 8th week, my daughter Sarah flew in from California. My youngest always was the sunshine of our family. Sarah brought with her drawings from the grandchildren, and a video message, "Grandma, we're waiting for you to come back to tell us fairy tales." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears seeing me in the wheelchair, my face and arms stiffened. I knew I had to be stronger than ever. I was not only fighting for myself, but for the grandchildren, for Sarah, and for Frank. They needed to see their grandmother, their mother, their wife not giving up. Sarah stayed for a week, rising early each day to make my favorite meals, reading newspapers aloud to me, and, most importantly, she brought along an old family photo album. We went through each page, reliving my 65-year journey, little Eleanor running barefoot through fields, teacher Eleanor at public school, Grandma Eleanor holding her first grandchild. "See, Mom." Sarah pointed to a photograph of me hugging my grandmother, bedridden after a broken hip at 85. She recovered even when everyone said she couldn't. "You have her bounce-back gene." Those days with Sarah were precious. She wheeled me down to the hospital garden, helped me with light therapy exercises, and found every way to make me laugh. Sarah taught me to use an iPad to video call the grandchildren, letting me feel connected to the outside world again. When Sarah had to return to California, I was overcome with emotion. On her last night, I managed to say the clearest sentence since the stroke, "Sarah, I will be okay." My daughter hugged me, and we both cried, but this time, those tears held hope. Frank changed a lot after Sarah's visit. He brought a Polaroid camera, taking pictures of every small achievement and pinning them to a victory board in my room. He also requested the doctor to let me return home soon, promising to care for me in a familiar environment. The doctors agreed, on condition I keep up therapy at the local rehab center. Before I left, Karen gave me a small blue notebook. "Eleanor, every day write something you're grateful for. Even the simplest things." I promised I would. Back in our familiar house, I couldn't help but feel a bit desolate. Everything remained, the rocking chair, the porcelain collection, the little garden, but I was no longer the old Eleanor. Frank had modified the house, installed handrails in the bathroom, rearranged furniture so the wheelchair could pass more easily, and put our bed in the living room so I wouldn't have to deal with stairs. The first day home, Max didn't leave my side for a second. He would rest his head on my lap, licking my hand as if he understood I needed comfort. Looking around the living room where we'd held so many Christmas parties, I felt like a stranger. "I've lost so much," I scribbled in Karen's blue notebook on the first night. "But I still have Frank, Max, and a chance to watch my grandchildren grow." Physical therapy resumed at a local center. My new therapist, Jessica, was younger than Karen but just as patient. She designed a program focused on helping me stand and balance. I began with simple exercises, shifting weight from one leg to the other, then rising from a chair with support, then walking with parallel bars. Each session was a battle. My muscles were stiff and weak after weeks in a hospital bed. I still got dizzy and tired quickly. But I persisted. I remembered telling my young students, "Don't be afraid to fail, be afraid not to try." Jessica called me a warrior each time I managed to stand for a few more seconds, legs shaking and sweating. Frank always stood in the corner, eyes glued to me, ready to rush over if I fell. 2 weeks after coming home, I could stand for 30 seconds without anyone helping, a personal record. I wrote in the blue notebook, "Today, my legs remembered how to stand." But life doesn't always move forward. A month after returning home, I got a high fever and was hospitalized again. Pneumonia, a common complication in stroke patients. 3 days in the hospital robbed me of most of the strength I had regained. Back at rehab, standing felt as difficult as ever. I sunk into depression. Night after night I cried silently, feeling devastated by the setback. Frank tried to encourage me, but I just wanted to give up. One morning, Max knocked over my favorite bottle of perfume, an old birthday gift from Sarah. The familiar scent filled the room, suddenly reminding me of my mother. She had survived so much: the Great Depression, wars, being widowed young, raising 3 kids alone. Thompsons don't give up, she had always said. I tried to write in the blue notebook, but tears blurred the words. I am not allowed to give up. For Frank, the kids, the grandkids, and for myself. The next day, I asked Jessica to increase the intensity of my exercises. She was surprised but agreed. We added 2 more sessions each week, and I started speech therapy again. Every night, Frank and I spent 20 minutes standing by the bed together. He held my hand and told funny stories to distract me from the pain. Gradually, I regained what I'd lost. And even surpassed it. 6 weeks after the fever, I could stand for a full minute without support. There were days I hated everyone. I hated Frank for being too perfect, too patient, making me feel like a burden. I hated Jessica for being too young, too healthy, unable to understand what it's like to be trapped in a body that betrays you. I hated myself for being so weak and helpless. Fall arrived, yellow leaves covered the backyard. I sat by the window, watching Frank rake leaves, a chore we used to do together every October. Never had I felt so alone, despite Frank being just a window pane away. One afternoon, when Frank was helping me bathe, I suddenly shouted, "Enough, already." My voice was still slurred but clear enough for Frank to understand. I thrashed about, spilling water everywhere, soaking his clothes. "Don't want to live like this anymore." Frank stood still, water dripping from his clothes onto the floor. Instead of anger, he looked at me with understanding. "I know, Ellie. I know how much it hurts." I broke down crying like a child. Frank hugged me, his wet shirt pressed against me, the familiar smell of soap mixing with salty tears. "I'll be here," he whispered. "Even if you yell, hit me, or hate the whole world. I'll still be here." The next day, Frank called psychologist Dr. Beth Stevens, who specializes in stroke patients. She visited our home, a middle-aged woman with thick salt and pepper hair and understanding eyes. We talked, or rather I wrote and she read, about my anger, despair, and fears. "Eleanor, what you're experiencing is called a grieving process," she explained. "You're grieving the loss of who you used to be. This is completely normal. In fact, it's an important part of the recovery journey." Beth gave me a small book about stroke and depression, explaining that nearly 1/3 of stroke patients experience depression. "This isn't because you're weak," she said. "It's a chemical reaction in the brain, part of the healing process." In the following weeks, Beth visited once a week. We talked about my biggest fears: never being able to walk independently again, becoming a permanent burden to Frank, never playing with my grandchildren the way I used to. One afternoon, Beth suggested a new method: writing letters to Eleanor before the stroke and Eleanor now. Frank helped me write, as my right hand was still weak. I wrote about longing, gratitude, and finally, a promise: I will not give up on us. Beth also introduced me to an online support group for stroke survivors. Here, I read stories of people who had overcome similar or worse adversities. Martha, 70, had to relearn speaking and walking after a severe stroke, and now taught dance classes for seniors at a community center in Ohio. Roger, an 80-year-old veteran who lost movement in his right side, still volunteered reading stories to children at the library from his electric wheelchair. They hadn't just survived, they had found new meaning for their lives. I began following along, chatting, gradually becoming bold enough to share my own journey. Each time I wrote about my pain and hope, I felt a little lighter. I realized that anger and grief didn't make me weak, they were normal, even necessary before I could face challenges again. I still had disappointing days, especially during walking practice when my right leg remained weak, and I'd fall if I lost focus. But Jessica always reminded me, progress isn't a straight line, Mrs. Eleanor. One step forward, 2 steps back is still progress if you don't quit. One day, sitting in my wheelchair by the window, watching Kansas sunlight filtering through bare tree branches, I remembered something my mother used to say, sometimes, all you can do is live fully today, then start again tomorrow. I knew I would have good days and bad days. What mattered was that there was always a tomorrow to try again. Connecting with the support group not only pulled me out of the dark cloud of depression, it also rekindled in me the meaning of sharing. We organized online meetings every Monday and Friday, telling each other about our week, small steps forward, failures, the joy of opening the refrigerator door by ourselves, or tying our own shoes. Mary texted encouragement every morning, Eleanor, tell me what you accomplished today, however tiny. I found that having friends going through the same challenges made fears much less overwhelming. Frank sent me articles about elderly people running marathons, climbing mountains, or setting Guinness records after 70. He wanted me to believe that age wasn't a reason to give up, much less a reason not to dream big. Then one day, during a group chat, Roger asked, Mrs. Eleanor, what's the craziest thing you dreamed of doing when young but never dared to try? I laughed, then remembered, I always dreamed of going to Colorado, climbing up the Rocky Mountains. I read books about the area, wished to stand on top, look down at the valley in the early morning, breathe deeply the fresh air and feel small amid nature's vastness. Roger laughed heartily, then why not plan for it, even if slowly, even if using a wheelchair or walker? The support group cheered me on. In that moment, my youthful dream rekindled, stronger than ever. I decided to set a goal. Before my 67th birthday, I would conquer at least one steep mountain trail with Frank and friends, no matter what. I began researching, reading travel books, going online to ask about wheelchair-accessible trails, seeking help from the rehabilitation center to design an appropriate training program. Now I had a big goal to wake up for each day, not just to survive, but to move forward. With a new goal, I felt completely rejuvenated. Each morning I told myself, Eleanor, today we move one step closer, even if just a small step. Jessica enthusiastically scheduled special training for me, not just to regain strength but to practice breathing and balance for the field trip. The first exercise was standing up from the wheelchair, holding onto a fixed bar, maintaining balance as long as possible. At first just a few seconds, then 10 seconds, then half a minute. Frank always stood by cheering, while Max hovered around biting his ball, as if encouraging me too. Once I let go, falling forward, but Frank caught me in time. I no longer cried with each failure, but encouraged myself, next time will be better. Jessica also guided me to practice walking on uneven surfaces, simulating trails in state parks. We moved to a nearby park. I used a walker, with Frank and Jessica always by my side. I loved feeling the wind, smelling decaying leaves, hearing children play, everything seemed more beautiful after the ordeal. Language exercises intensified too. I watched morning news, repeating headlines. I told jokes to the support group via Zoom, and though still slurring at first, everyone laughed and applauded in encouragement. Those first days, I was exhausted by afternoon, often wanting to just fall asleep. But I didn't allow myself to skip any sessions. Sometimes I pushed my wheelchair into the garden, practiced transferring from the chair to a stone bench, looking at the apple tree I'd planted when Sarah was little. Frank made small plans. Every weekend he'd take me to a different park in Kansas to test different terrains. In early April, I completed a 1-mile trail at Tallgrass Prairie Park. Just wheelchair and some walking with a frame, but I felt like I'd finished a marathon. I also became more proactive in daily life, dressing myself, preparing simple breakfasts, video calling grandchildren and reading fairy tales to them in an increasingly clearer voice. Sarah sent me videos of the grandchildren cheering, "Go Grandma, you're our superhero." With that spirit, I joined the support group in planning a Walk for the Stroke Community Day. I stood on stage, if only for a few minutes, giving a short speech about my journey. The entire hall applauded endlessly. In their eyes, I was no longer a fragile patient, but an inspiration. That summer, Frank and I carefully discussed the Colorado trip. I asked the support group to connect me with organizations specializing in travel for people with disabilities. It turned out many trails in the Rocky Mountains were quite wheelchair-friendly. I set a specific goal: to complete the Alpine Ridge Trail, a path nearly 1 mile long, with some steep sections but offering spectacular views overlooking the valley and mountain range. Frank planned meticulously, renting a suitable van, booking disabled accessible hotel rooms, buying additional lightweight walking equipment, hiring a professional guide for safety. Mary from the support group expressed interest in joining, and Frank's friends also offered to come along for encouragement. I made a list of things to prepare: medications, therapy tools, books, phone to document the journey. And most importantly, a small sign with the motivational words from my first day leaving the hospital: "You can do it, Eleanor." The more I prepared, the more strongly I felt the desire to explore, conquer, and reclaim the freedom I once had. It had been so long since my heart raced with such hope for something. One evening, during a video call with Sarah and the grandchildren, I said, "Grandma will send photos from the mountaintop. And I hope you'll continue to dream big, no matter what happens in life." The day of departure finally arrived. The specially rented van parked in front of our house. Frank had packed all the assistive equipment, medications, and personal items we needed. I woke up at 5 a.m., full of excitement and worry. Would I be strong enough for this trip? Would the weather cooperate? And if I failed, if I couldn't make it down that trail, then what? Frank took my hand, kissed my forehead gently and whispered, "You'll do it, Eleanor. Whatever happens, we've already won." Mary arrived early with her husband, Jim. Our other elderly friends, Nancy and Robert, were also ready. We formed a small group of 6 energetic seniors, average age over 65, determined to conquer the Rocky Mountains. As the van pulled away, I looked back at our familiar house one last time. That was where I thought I'd never leave again after the stroke. Yet here I was, on my way to another state, to fulfill a dream I thought had faded away. The journey from Kansas to Colorado took nearly 9 hours. We stopped many times so I could move around, do small exercises to avoid stiffness, and eat lunch together at rest stops. Frank had prepared turkey sandwiches and fruit salad, my favorite lunch. Along the way, the scenery gradually changed from Kansas's flat fields to rolling hills and finally the imposing mountains of Colorado. When the first snow-capped peaks appeared on the horizon, I squeezed Frank's hand, tears welling up. "Do you remember?" I asked, my speech much clearer after months of practice. "We talked about coming here more than 30 years ago, when Sarah was little." Frank nodded, his eyes also moist. "I remember. You said someday, when we retire, we'd come here and climb a mountain." We arrived at Estes Park, the gateway to Rocky Mountain National Park, late in the afternoon. The quaint hotel had wheelchair access and rooms specially designed for disabled guests. The hotel manager, Susan, warmly welcomed us. She gave me a map marking wheelchair-friendly trails. "I heard about your trip from the booking staff," Susan said. "It's truly inspiring. My husband also had a stroke 3 years ago, and now he can go fishing again." We retired early that night, preparing for the important day ahead. I lay in bed, listening to the wind whistling through pine trees outside the window and feeling a strange sense of peace. Whatever tomorrow brought, I had already conquered my greatest fear, the fear of never daring to dream again. The next morning, we woke up to a perfectly clear blue sky. I looked out the window, saw the early morning sunlight casting a beautiful pink glow on distant mountain peaks. "A perfect day," Frank said, bringing me a hot cup of coffee. "It seems even nature is on your side." After a light breakfast, we met Jake, the professional guide Frank had hired for the trip. He was a sturdy young man about 30, with a bright smile and patient eyes. Jake had experience working with disabled and elderly people on mountain trails. "We'll take the Alpine Ridge Trail," Jake explained as we gathered around the map. "It's the highest trail but also relatively flat compared to other trails. From the top, you can see the whole valley and mountain range stretching out." "I think that's exactly what you want, isn't it, Mrs. Eleanor?" I nodded, nervous but determined. Jake continued explaining the plan. We would drive to the trailhead. I would use a special wheelchair with sturdier wheels for most of the journey. At sections the wheelchair couldn't navigate, I would use a walker with Jake and Frank supporting me on either side. Mary, Jim, Nancy, and Robert would come along, carrying water, snacks and medication. "Don't worry about speed," Jake told me. "We have all day. Rest when you need to, and remember, every step is a victory." We headed to the Alpine Ridge Trail starting point. When the car stopped at the parking lot, I looked out the window and saw other hikers, young, fit, well-equipped, warming up and taking photos. I wondered what they would think seeing an elderly woman in a wheelchair also wanting to conquer the same trail. Frank helped me out of the car and transferred me to the special wheelchair. Jake checked all safety equipment one last time. Mary put a wide-brimmed hat on me for sun protection, and Robert handed me a lightweight walking stick made of pine wood with my name carved on it, a surprise gift from the whole group. "For you to mark your journey," Robert said, his eyes twinkling with joy. With a pounding heart, I began the journey. The trail started off quite easy, wide, and relatively flat. The fresh mountain air filled my lungs, carrying the scent of grass and damp earth. I looked up at the crystal blue sky with fluffy white clouds and felt like I was being born again. After a while, the trail began to steepen. Frank and Jake pushed my wheelchair with Jim's help. I felt guilty for making them work so hard, but Frank just laughed. "This is the best cardio workout for us, my dear." At a bend in the trail, we stopped to rest and drink water. From here, the view had already opened up considerably, showing a vast valley below with a river winding like a silver ribbon. I sat there, eyes fixed on the magnificent scenery before me. Sunlight filtered through the trees, dancing on my face and on leaves just beginning to don their autumn yellow. Frank gently took my hand. "Eleanor, it's time for you to try walking," he said. I took a deep breath, pushing away worries. With Frank and Jake's steady support on either side, I slowly rose from the wheelchair, feeling my legs trembling, unsteady but determined. Each step was painfully slow, one beat at a time, as if I was being reborn with this vast nature. The first stretch was just a few steps, then a pause to catch my breath. I felt my muscles stretching, aching, but also full of life. That feeling, though painful, made me happier than I'd been in a long time. The group around me cheered enthusiastically, with encouragements like, "You're doing it," and "Wonderful," ringing out, making me smile like a child. Max, in my thoughts, would have loved this if he could have come along. As we continued the journey, I knew I might not be the fastest, might not be the most agile, but I was the most persistent. I was conquering the mountain, step by step, just as I had conquered challenges throughout my life. Finally, when we reached the top of Alpine Ridge, the sun was setting in the distance, painting the vast sky red. I stood still, took a deep breath, to feel that sacred moment. Below us was a wide world, beside my ears were bird songs, next to me were loved ones who hadn't left my side for a step. I could cry, laugh, say endless words of gratitude from my heart. I had gone from wheelchair to mountaintop. I had conquered illness, fear, and myself. Frank squeezed my hand, whispering, "We did it, Eleanor." I looked at him, at everyone, and said to myself, "This journey is not the end. It's the beginning of a new life, a life full of hope, courage, and freedom." Thank you for joining me on this journey. Please hit like, share, and subscribe to spread this story so no one has to face their life challenges alone. Each share is a beacon of hope for those fighting out there. And remember, no matter where you are, never give up on your dreams.